Was England ever truly safe under a Plantagenet king? Did John's desperate gamble in 1205 actually forge a new path, or simply mark the beginning of a kingdom perpetually teetering on the brink? The scent of salt and wood smoke still clung to Portsmouth that summer, a ghostly reminder of a king's audacious and ultimately disastrous attempt to reclaim a lost empire. Let's rewind, shall we, to a time when a crumbling corner of the Plantagenet Empire in Europe creaked and crumbled. All this was dismaying for John. As winter's death gripped England in the first months of 1205, it looked very much as if all of the holdings his family had accumulated within the Kingdom of France might soon be gone. It was not enough simply to cower in England and defend the coast, and John must have realized that his public reputation, never particularly high, was at a nadir from which it might never recover if he did not act swiftly. He would have to make a stand. Men like the Melrose chronicler were recording for posterity that he had ignominiously lost his castles and lands across the sea. So in the summer of 1205, as invasion fears began to subside, John began preparing for a huge assault on France, directed from 2 points of attack. A fleet from Portsmouth would beach on the Norman coast and reconquer the duchy from the west, while a second expedition from Dartmouth was to undertake a simultaneous advance on Poitou. This force would be commanded by John's illegitimate brother William Longespée, Earl of Salisbury, a man of about the same age as John, of high military reputation and experience, and a good friend of the king, with whom he passed many happy hours at the gaming table. To effect his plans, John ordered the largest military mobilization since Richard had embarked on Crusade. He would preside over a massive expansion of royal sea power. Richard had been the first Plantagenet king to amass a significant English naval force, mobilizing large numbers of boats in 1190, building another 70 vessels to patrol the Seine in 1196, and founding Portsmouth as the great naval town to link England with Normandy. John now carried this further. 45 warships had been built to patrol England's coasts in 1203 to 1204. To expand the naval force any faster would require different means. In 1205, John simply seized all the shipping vessels that his constables deemed convertible for war. Even if a vessel was only large enough to carry a few horses, it was appropriated from its owner and amassed for the nascent Royal Navy. Imagine the chaos. The sudden appearance of royal ships commandeering fishing boats, merchant vessels, anything seaworthy, transforming the familiar coastline into a bristling network of warships. The constables, men accustomed to overseeing local affairs, were now forced to surrender their livelihoods to the king's ambition. It was a brutal efficiency, a demonstration of power that left little room for dissent. To fill the warships, there was a drive to muster men and materiel. Thousands upon thousands of horseshoes, nails, crossbow bolts, and arrowheads were struck. Pig carcasses were salted and great sides of venison rumbled on carts down to the coast. The national coinage was recommissioned. New silver pennies stamped with John's image flooded the country. Everyone handling one in receipt of payment for a service rendered to the war effort would have looked upon his king's face, his hair curling about his ears, his beard cropped short, and his eyes, even in the simple minted likeness, bulging out at the holder, daring that person to defy him. Think of the sheer volume of it. A sea of silver pennies, a visual representation of the king's demands, a constant reminder of the price of loyalty. It was a calculated move, a way to exert control and ensure that every subject contributed to the war effort. These coins weren't just money, they were propaganda, a visual declaration of John's authority. Many of these coins were used to recruit mercenary soldiers, sailors and men-at-arms who were transported to the coast as midsummer approached. Perhaps a quarter of a year's revenue was pumped into military preparation, funding the vast human cargo that was loaded onto the great ships that floated in the Solent. According to the English chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall, it was the largest English army ever assembled and the greatest collection of ships in a single English port. Picture this: hundreds of ships crammed with soldiers, horses, supplies, and the simmering tension of a desperate gamble. The Solent, a narrow channel separating the Isle of Wight from the mainland, transformed into a bustling harbor of war, a testament to John's ambition and the scale of his undertaking. The air would have been thick with the smell of salt, sweat, and fear. Here at last John was acting with purpose. If England was busy, however, it was not entirely united. Although John proved he could assemble a vast army, he was hamstrung by the changing mood of the English barons. John's invasion preparations may have resembled a crusade muster, but the cause did not move hearts with quite the same fervor. Henry II had been careful to pursue the Norman habit of keeping his barons' cross-channel estates intact. He had retained the political integrity of the Anglo-Norman realm by making sure that the great lords remained truly Anglo-Norman, with interests and lands that spanned both territories, and gave them a self-interest in assisting the king to keep them together and defend them from external threats. John's loss of Normandy, however, profoundly changed a status quo that had existed for nearly 150 years. Forced to decide whether they wished to keep their lands in England or in Normandy, most barons made a choice in 1204 and threw in their lot with one king or the other. They ceased almost overnight to become Anglo-Normans and pledged their allegiance either as English subjects or as French. The Channel became a divide rather than a causeway between kingdom and duchy. A few great lords like William Marshal came to private arrangements with both kings for the security of their lands in both kingdoms. They were in an equally ambiguous position. Some had paid homage to Philip for their Norman lands and to John for their English. It was impossible to go to war with either lord without betraying their promise to the other. Imagine the political tightrope walk. These barons, caught between two powerful monarchs, were forced to navigate a treacherous landscape of loyalty and obligation. Their oaths were double-edged swords, capable of both securing their wealth and threatening their very existence. The very air around Portchester Castle crackled with suspicion and resentment. So when John arrived in Portsmouth to inspect his marvelous fleet in 1205, he found his English barons unwilling to come with him and fight. There was a furious argument at Portchester Castle between John and Marshal. The king accused Marshal of acting treasonably in coming to terms with Philip. Marshal gave a grand speech in which he presented himself as betrayed by the king and warned his fellow barons that the king planned to disinherit him and will do the same to all of you once he becomes powerful enough. Picture the scene: John, radiating fury, confronting William Marshal, a pillar of the English nobility, accusing him of treason. The room would have been filled with the weight of unspoken threats and simmering resentment. It wasn't just a disagreement, it was a declaration of war, a battle for the hearts and minds of the barons. Even if the rest of the barons had been prepared to trust in John's character as a general, they were now deeply unswayed by the prospect of fighting either for Norman lands in which they had no interest or against a king in Philip, whose wrath was potentially as great as John's. As the mood turned sharply against setting out for the French coast, Marshal and Hubert Walter begged the king not to cross the Channel. Walter listed some practical reasons. Philip was massively more wealthy and militarily stronger. John had precious few safe houses on the continent and was relying on an alliance with Poitevins, who were a naturally treacherous race. The king should not leave England undefended when Philip's nobles had designs on invasion themselves, and England had no heir should John meet his end on the battlefield. It amounted to a mass mutiny, in the most humiliating circumstances imaginable. The whole invasion force at Portsmouth was now useless, for without the barons who were to provide leadership and their own private resources, there was no hope of retaking Normandy. John was beside himself with rage. The king put to sea for a couple of days, sailing up and down the coast in the fruitless hope that he might shame or persuade the barons into changing their minds. It was to no avail. Salisbury's expedition from Dartmouth successfully crossed the Channel to reinforce the garrison of La Rochelle, but for the most part all the preparations of 1205 had come to nothing. Across the Channel, Philip went about his business, going merrily into territories that his father could only have dreamed of visiting. The fall of Chinon and Laux in the summer meant that the whole of Touraine was now in French hands. It had been another disastrous year. Imagine the frustration, the sheer humiliation of a king, accustomed to absolute authority, reduced to pacing the coastline in despair. The ambition that had fueled his preparations now seemed to mock him, a cruel reminder of his failure. And across the Channel, Philip II, a shrewd and calculating ruler, was consolidating his gains, expanding his territory, and tightening his grip on the Duchy of Normandy. While it would scarcely have been possible to repeat the fiascos of 1204 and 1205, it is still to John's credit that in 1206 he experienced an upturn in his fortunes. Instead of being cowed by the failure of his invasion, he adjusted his sights. He spent the winter of 1205 sending chests of treasure to various potential allies across the Channel and the spring of 1206 touring the north of England, attempting to personally charm the barons of Yorkshire, Cumberland, Cheshire, and Lancashire into supporting his military endeavors. In April 1206, another large expedition set off from England, this time aiming for Poitou. John was at the head, supported by the barons he had either bribed or coaxed into following him. Arriving at La Rochelle in June, he led an army around the lower coastal regions of France and recovered parts of Aquitaine, regained the Saintonge, strengthened his hand in his wife's county of Angoulême, and reversed the gains that Alfonso VIII had made in Gascony. Toward the end of summer, the king allied himself with the powerful Poitevin Baron Aymery de Thouars and marched north toward Anjou. There they received word that Philip II, who had preferred to assure himself that Normandy was secure, was raising an army of his own. Not willing to let a whole summer's gains be undone by defeat, John backed away, and in October 1206 he agreed to a 2-year truce with Philip. Picture a king humbled but not defeated, shifting his strategy, abandoning grand ambitions for smaller, more achievable goals. It wasn't a victory, but it was a survival. A testament to John's capacity for adaptation, a recognition that even the most ambitious plans could be thwarted by the complexities of politics and war. It had been a moderately successful campaign. Still, the fact remained that John now ruled over England, the Channel Islands, and a reduced coastal rump of Aquitaine, a mere slice of the great territories he had inherited. He was a king of England who, unlike his predecessors, would be forced to remain in his kingdom. As John learned to rule England, the realm discovered what it meant to have a restless, aggressive Plantagenet king permanently in its midst. They found him a busy overlord. John wanted to know his kingdom intimately, and he was always on the move. This was not entirely novel, for itinerant travel was a matter of kingly necessity, and very few areas of the English countryside could accommodate a king and his vast court for long. But even by royal standards, John was a restless traveler. He rarely stayed anywhere for more than a few days, picking his way from royal castles and hunting lodges to palaces and manors, resting a while before moving immediately on. Imagine a caravan of hundreds, perhaps thousands of people, a swirling mass of servants, soldiers, courtiers, and animals, constantly on the move, leaving a trail of disruption and extravagance in its wake. John's royal progress was a magnificent spectacle. And while its presence would have lain heavy on the shoulders of the Englishmen who had to bear the burden of royal hospitality, the approach of the royal court also came with some advantages. For under John, the court was not simply a traveling circus, it was also a judicial circuit. Everywhere he went, John thought of lawgiving. His tutor as a young man had been Henry II's Chief Justice and one of the leading legal thinkers of his age, Ranulph Glanville. As a result, John was deeply interested in the role of a king as supreme judge. He engaged with the law and sat in legal judgment with unprecedented zeal. He took a close personal interest in the smallest, meanest cases, and his law was much in demand. He traveled with professional justices in tow and sat with them as they heard the cases that were waiting in the localities for the king's law to arrive and decide them. Think of the impact on ordinary people. The image of a king, not just a ruler but a judge, dispensing justice in a small village, hearing the grievances of peasants, resolving disputes between neighbors. It was a radical departure from the traditional role of the monarchy, a demonstration of John's desire to be seen as a just and benevolent ruler. We have some extraordinary images of John's court touching the lives of ordinary people in the early 13th century. The beneficiaries of his judicial intervention were many and varied. He gave reprieve to a little boy who had accidentally killed a friend by throwing a stone. He dismissed a case against a mentally deficient man who had confessed to a crime of which he was clearly innocent. He threw himself into the minutiae of cases that touched in only the slightest degree on his royal prerogative or interest. He was concerned for the plight of the poor. And yet, beneath the surface of this seemingly benevolent rule lay a darker current. John's obsession with wealth and power, his willingness to exploit his subjects, and his ruthless pursuit of justice, often delivered in a way that favored the wealthy and powerful, fueled resentment and discontent. Of course, John could not run government and the legal system single-handed. Hubert Walter, the Archbishop of Canterbury and veteran administrative servant, had died from a septic carbuncle on his back in July 1205, and John had, according to several chroniclers, declared, "Now for the first time I am King of England." With Walter gone, the king gathered around him a new set of advisors and officials. Some were brought over from the lost continental territories. Men like Peter des Roches, Peter de Malle, Fawkes de Breut, and Gerard Dathy were noticeable for their foreign names and manners, which reminded Englishmen that their king was not a native prince, even if he was now restricted to the realm. But there was not a wholesale takeover of government by foreigners. English-born men retained high posts. They included the justiciar Geoffrey Fitz-Peter, the treasurer William of Ely, and the chief forester Hugh Neville. After 1206, the overriding aim for all those men, and for John too, was simple: they needed to raise money. John was going to require vast sums of cash, both to fund his own armies of mercenaries and to pay a network of continental allies to oppose Philip. It promised to be a more expensive task than it had been for any of his ancestors. John set about the task of exploiting those English revenues with a vigor that was evident to all. The hostile chronicler Roger of Wendover spread stories that John was a tight-fisted man who gave lousy tips to those who helped him. This was largely slanderous, but it demonstrated the popular view that the king was a miser obsessed with scraping every penny from his subjects, for indeed there were piles of pennies to scrape. As John traveled England, he would have seen everywhere the signs of its prosperity, even after the heavy tax burdens of Richard's reign. The early 13th century was a period of booming development in trade and industry, as well as monetary inflation originating in European silver from newly discovered mines, which had been flooding the country with coin since the 1180s. In 1207, John made his first serious move to tap this wealth. On goods, revenues, lands, and property, he levied a 13th, a tax of 1 shilling in every mark on the whole country's movable goods. It raised an astonishing amount of money for the royal coffers, £57,425, or more than 2 years' revenue. There had been a steady series of experiments with this sort of tax during the previous 2 decades, but the 13th was an extraordinary success, which emphasized both the wealth that existed in England and the Crown's ability to tap into it through a well-organized system of royal administration. Although John did not know or plan it, the 13th was to form the tax model on which all the regular income of medieval and Tudor England would be based. Direct taxation of the wealthy was only part of his drive to exploit the revenues of his realm. For John, the most obvious way to accrue greater profit from kingship was through the legal system. In this, he used 2 interlocking tactics. The first involved the simple profits of justice. When Henry II had established a deep and penetrative system of royal justice and government, by which the royal law was easily accessible throughout England, and the role of the royal sheriff was the most important position in local government, it had not been done for the pure love of administrative reform. Rather, there was a clear understanding that justice was a profitable enterprise. The royal chancery made money from selling writs. The crown prospered handsomely from the fines and forfeitures of property that were the result of criminal convictions in the courts. The heirs' large itinerant courts of justice that traveled the country both restored law and order and brought in a great deal of money to the crown, and the accompanying forest heirs dealing specifically with crimes committed in the king's forest land, which aggressively asserted the rights of the crown over the extensive forest land that stretched across England, were pure profit-making enterprises. A whole series of forest heirs were sent out between 1207 and 1210 as John squeezed every last penny from his subjects. These courts were notoriously harsh, and they often resulted in the confiscation of land and property, enriching the king and his officials at the expense of the local population. The system was designed to extract wealth, not to dispense justice. We have some extraordinary images of John's court touching the lives of ordinary people in the early 13th century. The beneficiaries of his judicial intervention were many and varied. He gave reprieve to a little boy who had accidentally killed a friend by throwing a stone. He dismissed a case against a mentally deficient man who had confessed to a crime of which he was clearly innocent. He threw himself into the minutiae of cases that touched in only the slightest degree on his royal prerogative or interest. He was concerned for the plight of the poor. And yet, beneath the surface of this seemingly benevolent rule lay a darker current. John's obsession with wealth and power, his willingness to exploit his subjects, and his ruthless pursuit of justice, often delivered in a way that favored the wealthy and powerful, fueled resentment and discontent. Was John's reign a turning point, a moment when the foundations of English monarchy were irrevocably altered? Or simply a tragic episode in the Plantagenet dynasty, a cautionary tale of ambition, greed, and ultimately failure?